Thank you for that song service. It's good to be back with you today. Last time I was with you, we were talking about parenting, and it occurred to me a few moments ago that one of the best things that you can do for your children is to take care of your marriage, is to build a strong marriage. So I'm thankful again to the elders and leaders of the congregation here. Having a day devoted to focus on our marriages. Hey, can we raise the bar? Can we raise the level of expectation that we have for ourselves and our relationship with the ones that we love the most? This morning in our class, I suggested to you that I believe that marriage and family life is a place of spiritual warfare. You don't get married and the devil leaves you alone. You don't bring children into this world and the devil leaves them alone. We're in a raging battle for the hearts and minds, the character and the faith of our children that begins at the cradle and should never end this side of our grave. I'll be doing battle for the hearts and minds, the faith of my children and my grandchildren from their cradle to my grave. And I'm here to tell you we're in a battle for the sanctity of our marriages that begins at the altar and should never end this side of eternity. Marriage and family is a place of spiritual warfare. I suggested to you that I have a curiosity about couples. Kind of interesting to stand up here and look out into the audience and just kind of wonder how you chose one another. I said in my class that if you knew Wanda, you would wonder how she ended up with a crustacean like Steve. You know, how do we choose one another? I have a curiosity about that. But I'm just as curious about what leads couples apart over time. The devil is scheming, and how does the devil drive a wedge between couples? How is it you and I know couples that have pledged their love for one another, committed their lives, their hearts to one another, and then 7 years into this, they can hardly stand to be in one another's presence. You've seen it, haven't you? You don't have to look far. Marriage and family is a place of spiritual warfare. So in our class, we suggested that if we can identify the factors that will lead you apart over time, then you can be intentional about resisting those things, about mitigating those things. You can have some strategies to construct, to build a strong marriage, and you can resist the devil's schemes to divide you. So we want to look at this hour at two more factors that would lead you apart. If you would, allow me to make a commercial and challenge you to come back after our fellowship meal. I know you're going to be tempted, maybe, perhaps, you got other things you could do. Let me just do a social research here. How many of you like to be in control? Just, fess up if you like to be in control. Many of us, we like to be in control. Well, this afternoon, we're going to talk about the control factor. The control factor. Matter of fact, I'm going to encourage some of you to be in control and make sure that the two of you get back here this afternoon after our meal, okay? Or maybe you're like me. You've had those moments when you wonder why your private spiritual life at home did not seem to quite mirror your spiritual life within the community of faith. Well, we're going to talk about that this afternoon, so I hope you'll come back after our meal. We have a rather serious topic to look at during this hour, two more factors that we will try to address. Factor number 3 is called the flaw factor. It's not easy. Looking back on it, when I think about the whole process of dating and courtship, I would suggest to you that it is a rather artificial environment in which to evaluate a relationship sometimes, isn't it? If you think about dating and courtship, aren't we mostly putting our best foot forward? Yeah, I think so. We're putting our best foot forward, and I would suggest to you that there could be some unintentional deception back when you're dating one another. And hey, I've even seen where there's sometimes intentional deception, right? And so if we're not careful, we may fail to discover their less than best self, if you know what I mean. their sin nature, perhaps. I'm reminded of the husband, the young husband who, after about a year of marriage, he went back to the preacher that had done their marriage ceremony, and he was talking to the preacher about how difficult their first year of marriage had been. It's supposed to be a honeymoon, a sweet season, but he was sharing with the preacher about just how difficult this first year of marriage was. So after talking for an hour or so, the young husband went to leave, and the preacher said, "I want to remind you that you took her for better or worse." And the young husband looked back at the preacher and said, "Yes, I did, but she turned out to be worse than I took her to be." And so that's a little humor to a serious subject. It's called the flaw factor. It's not easy. Your marriage soon encounters the flaw factor. In fact, it is harder than you thought it would be. You vowed to love them unconditionally, but you don't know just how imperfect he or she is. In fact, you soon discover that marriage involves two imperfect people entering into a committed relationship, diligently pursuing intimacy under the rule of God. Marriage involves two imperfect people. I would suggest to you that mine is an imperfect love for Wanda, and Wanda's is an imperfect love for me. You discover that you have different sin natures, and that spiritual warfare began in the garden, and it is alive and well today. Take, for example, the story of Eric and Angela. He was her knight in shining armor when their marriage came face to face with spiritual warfare. She writes it this way: "I thought my marriage was solid and happy. Eric and I had been married a few years, and everything seemed to be going well for us. Then one day, completely unexpected, Eric confessed to me that he had struggled with online pornography for most of his life, including since we had been married. The feelings of shock and disbelief I had quickly turned to hurt and anger. How could he have done this to me? As the shock wore off, I carried feelings of numbness and hurt and anger and shame all at the same time. I was a mess. But I was certain of one thing: nobody was going to find out about what had happened in our marriage. I was captive to worrying about what others would think of us. A couple of years went by, and I had managed my feelings by denying them. I hoped I could keep temptation away from Eric and he away from temptation if I prayed hard enough. Of course, it's always great to pray, but let's just say that I was using prayer as a Band-Aid to hide my own deep wounds. It wouldn't be until I found a recovery program that I started my own healing. Our marriage went on to have great healing as we both worked on recovery. God has a wonderful way of not wasting our hurts. Out of our mess, He gave us the ministry of noble choices. And they now have a ministry to couples, Noble Choices. What would you say to this young couple as they come face to face with spiritual warfare? Spiritual warfare began in the garden. It is alive and well today. What would you say? Well, let me first suggest that women can be rather hurtful too. Wanda and I know a couple where the husband, in our mind, is a good and godly man, and they married and went on to have several daughters. And we would suggest to you that the husband has been the recipient of almost a constant ridicule, a constant criticism, oftentimes clothed in jest, oftentimes clothed in joking from his wife, watch this, and his children. O'Donnell and Morris described it this way. Many men take injury upon injury from their wives and children and just hide the blood. They quickly cover the wounds from sight of others, but the painful injuries do not disappear simply because they are hidden. If anything, they fester and grow deeper as more jabs and punches are aimed at the unhealed wounds. Women can be hurtful too. They go on to say this. Watch this. One man said that taking the role of spiritual leader for his wife equates for him with standing to speak in front of a large audience with no pants on. Why? Because his wife knows all his failures, all his weaknesses, and as he said, watch this, seems to have a special gland that helps her recall these failures in an instant when I fail again. Therefore, why try to change the status quo? Why risk ridicule or lack of support from your wife and possibly even your children? Yes, women can be hurtful too. There are many men out there who believe that there was a time when they made themselves vulnerable. Perhaps they tried to lead in some way. Perhaps they shared their heart and they paid a price for it. Perhaps they were ridiculed or their decisions were questioned or somehow they were made to look small. You know what I mean? I would suggest to you that that man will think twice and a third time before he shares his heart again, before he tries to lead in that way again. I suggest to you that your children will most likely survive the well-intended blunders of your husband's parenting, but they won't do so well with a father who backs away from his parenting responsibilities because he can't do it good enough, well enough to satisfy you. Similarly, in a marriage, your marriage will likely survive your husband's well-intended mistakes along the way, but it will not survive the husband who disengages from you because he can never do it good enough. You with me? They go on to say, we can all see a part of us that can be easily crushed. And of all people in this world, who knows better than a man's wife how to crush his ego? In fact, it is often a man's wife whose arrows hold the most potent poison because she knows his biggest weaknesses and is close enough to take perfect aim. Are you with me? We husbands at times do things that hurt our wives deeply. Wives at times do things that hurt their husbands deeply. They go on to say, you hold the words of life for your husband, even if he seems nonchalant about your feelings, even if he doesn't seem concerned about your approval. He is. He just doesn't know how to admit it without feeling overly vulnerable. It's called the flaw factor. It's not easy. It's not easy living with me. It's not easy living with you. I like the way this author put it. When we expect perfection out of marriage, we are setting ourselves up for disaster. Marriage means torturous work and a predictable routine. That's what you should expect. Instead, a successful marriage has little to do with sustained bliss and everything to do with surrendering to the grind. I hope that is at least a little bit of a hyperbole, surrendering to the grind. No, I hope not. But I do think the point is well taken. When we expect perfection out of marriage, we are setting ourselves up for disappointment, aren't we? So what would be a brick of construction? What is it that we could take hold of, that we could possess, that would help us mitigate, help us deal with the flaw factor. It's not easy. I would suggest to you that forgiveness is our brick, that the best marriages are made up of two good givers and two good forgivers. We talked about remodeling and rebuilding a marriage, a relationship this morning in class, and I would suggest to you that oftentimes remodeling, rebuilding our marriage needs to begin with forgiveness. But you may ask, yes, but how do you forgive when you've been hurt deeply? How do you forgive when you've been wounded in that way? Matter of fact, you might even say something like this: how do you forgive the unforgivable? How do you love the unlovable? I'm often reminded that Jesus was crucified by those who were supposed to love him the most. Amen. Jesus was crucified. He was nailed to a cross by the very people who were supposed to love him the most. And I would suggest to you that you and I may at some point in our lives be nailed to a cross by those who are supposed to love us the most. Maybe your spouse who hurts you most deeply, who nails you to a cross. It could be one of your children who's rebelled and hurt you deeply. How do you forgive the unforgivable? How do you love the unlovable? Where do you find the power? I mean, the power to let go and forgive when you've been deeply hurt, when you've been deeply wounded. And I'm going to suggest to you that I don't know of any place you find the power. As Christians, I don't know of any place you find the power to forgive when you've been hurt that deeply, other than your own personal identification with the cross. And listen to me, words spoken from a cross. What did Jesus say to those who rejected him, to his own people who were supposed to love him? What did he say when they nailed him to the cross? He stretched forth his hands and he said, Father, what? Forgive them, for they know not what they do. And I'm here to tell you, some of you may need to look at your spouse and stretch forth your hands and say, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. You find the power to forgive and to let go the deepest hurts and wounds by your own personal identification with words spoken from a cross. Luke 9:23 says, Then he said to them all, If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. Listen to me. I want to be a Christian. I don't mind being a Christian. I just don't like being crucified. And Scripture says you take up your cross, what? Daily, and follow me. And it may mean that you need to look at your spouse and say, forgive them, for they know not what they do. They know not what they have done. And so I like the way Gordon MacDonald puts it when he's talking about the flaw factor. It's not easy. He says, can I devote myself to a person who is far from perfect, but who wants to share a common life with me? Will I choose to love a person because he is perfect, or because he is through and through who he is? Real devotion begins the day I accept my husband, wife, as a wonderful, lovable sinner. Oh, there's no doubt that Erica and Angela were going to have to speak to and address the perils of online temptation that are so common to man, right? It would destroy their marriage. They were going to have to address that. But could Angela come to see him and vice versa as a wonderful, lovable sinner? I've got written in the margins of my Bible, watch this, if God can save me by grace, I can live with Wanda by grace. If God can extend grace to me, I can extend grace to her. Sometimes I get asked, do you forgive and forget? It's a pretty popular book title, and it's probably good for selling books perhaps. But I would suggest to you that no, you don't forgive and forget. You forgive and act as though you've forgotten. But I would suggest to you, I don't want to forget, because see, I don't want to ever go back there again. See, I don't want to forget, because I never plan to return there again. I can forgive and act as if I have forgotten. So this week, how about praying for the ability to acknowledge our wrongs and to both ask for and extend forgiveness of one another? Brick number 8 that goes with the flaw factor, it's not easy. Brick number 8 is commitment. I don't know how you would define commitment. I know how Sir Hernando Cortez defined commitment. Maybe you remember the story. He led a Spanish expedition looking for golden treasures. He had 4 or 5 ships, I believe it was. He landed in South America, I think it was, and he had his men unload all the cargo supplies from the ships, right? And had all the supplies on shore, and then he gave them the command. Some of you know it, right? Burn the ships. Burn the ships. I believe Hernando Cortez knew something, that is, they went on this journey together. As they went on this expedition, that they would encounter peril. Some of them would be killed by the natives of the country. Some of them would contract diseases and die. And at some point, they're going to want to turn and sail towards home, right? So I suggest to you that Cortez defined commitment this way. You limit your options. You limit your options. He said there's no turning back. When things get hard, we're not going to sail towards home. And I'm going to suggest to you that in our marriages, we need to limit our options. I like what the young groom did. In his wedding ceremony, he expressed his commitment to his wife. I will never, ever leave you. And then the next day, he went out and bought 2 burial plots. And he sent a very powerful message. We're not going to sail towards home. We're going to limit our options. That's what you call commitment. Or perhaps you remember the story of Superman, more specifically Christopher Reeve. He was an equestrian, riding horses. You remember the story. It was really, he had just become a big hit in the movies with Superman. He was at the top of his career, I guess. And he was competing in an equestrian event. And you may remember his horse Buck, as it jumped over, it stumbled, and all 6'4", 235 pounds of Christopher Reeve went over the head of his, he said his arms got tangled in the bridle and he couldn't put his hands out to break his fall, and he broke his neck. He was gasping for air. He didn't know if he would live. In the hospital, they put him on one of those machines that would breathe for you. And his wife, Dana, comes in and comes up to the machine, and Christopher Reeve mouthed the words to her, "Maybe we should let me go." He said he was lying there thinking about all the things that he couldn't do anymore. and how he had messed up his life. And he looked at her and said, maybe we should let me go. Dana started crying and looked at him and said, the decision is yours. But I want you to know that you're still you, and I love you. You're still you, and I love you. He said, I knew then we would be family. See, when you commit that way, you don't want to leave. And if you know the rest of the story, she stayed with him till the end, till he passed away. She was there with. That's commitment. You limit your options. It's part of what we do to address the flaw factor. Yes, it's not easy, but you're still you, and I love you. I like this quote. Family solidarity takes hard work, much imagination, and constant self-criticism on the part of all the members. A successful marriage is not one in which two people, beautifully matched, find each other and get along happily ever after. It is instead a means by which persons who are sinful and contentious are so caught by a dream bigger than themselves that they work throughout the years, in spite of repeated disappointment, to make the dream come true. Oh, isn't that good? It is instead a means by which persons who are sinful and contentious are so caught by a bigger dream. What's the bigger dream? So caught by a bigger dream bigger than themselves that they work throughout the years in spite of repeated disappointment to make the dream come true. What's the dream? I'm going to suggest to you that the dream is to make a holy life together, to help one another get to heaven. That's the bigger dream. Oh, I hope some of the things that we talk about today would be an encouragement to you in your marriage, and that you would be happy and satisfied in your marriage. But I'm here to tell you, I'm not here primarily out of concern for your happiness. You see, I believe God is far more concerned about your holiness than your happiness. Amen. We need to catch the bigger dream as couples of making a holy life together, to helping one another get to heaven, which leads us to the change factor. That's just the way I am. Oh, how does God use marriage to make us a more holy people? When I was in Tallahassee, Florida, there was a couple that had been married about 8 years. They came to see me for some counseling, and in the very first session, she identified what she was requesting change in their marriage, in their relationship. She was simply asking that he would be more affectionate towards her, that he could speak words of affection into her heart, that he would touch her in ways that expressed an affection, an admiration, a respect for her. It seemed like a legitimate request to me, that there would be appropriate affection in their relationship. But I'll never forget his response to her that day. He said, you came from a family that was very open, very affectionate with one another. I didn't come from a family that particularly was expressive in affection. We weren't very affectionate with one another. Now watch this. He says, I wasn't particularly affectionate towards you before we got married. He says, we've been married for 8 years. I have not been particularly affectionate towards you. Let me make a note right here that it was not a knowledge issue. He knew exactly what she was requesting. He knew. And when it's not a knowledge issue, then it suggests that it's a heart issue. It has something to do with how you care for one another. And he goes on to say, you came from an affectionate family. I did not. Before marriage, I wasn't very affectionate. For 8 years, I haven't been very affectionate. And then he goes on to say, I'm not sure why it's a problem now. And then here's the punchline. He looks at her and he says, I'm not very affectionate, and that's just the way I am. What would you say? This is session number 1. If you were the therapist, what would you say? I'm not very affectionate, and that's just the way I am. If I remember correctly, I said something like this. Don't give me that's just the way I am. As best I recall, God is the only I am. I am being. The rest of us are called to become something other than what we are. Amen? Listen to me. Don't give me that's just the way I am. God is the only I am being. You and I are called to become something other than what we are. There's a lot of bad marriages out there because one or both of them give the other the message, that's just the way I am. I'm not changing. I don't have time today to talk about why people don't change, but maybe I could give you just one. Maybe just one as to why people don't change. How about this one? You would rather be unhappy than be uncomfortable. A lot of us are that way. We would rather be unhappy than uncomfortable. I'm here to tell you that I'm unhappy being 30 pounds overweight, but I'm highly uncomfortable getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and going and working out and then coming back home and going to work. Are you with me? And I've been overweight for quite some time. I'm unhappy with it, but all the other stuff, what that's required to do something about it, makes me uncomfortable. And we're a lot like that, aren't we? We'd rather be unhappy with where we are with one another than uncomfortable with what's required for changes. Watch what God would have to say about that. Jeremy shared it with us earlier. But who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? For he will be like a refiner's fire or launderer's soap. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. He will purify the Levites and refine them like gold and silver. Then the Lord will have men who will bring offerings in righteousness. How did they refine gold and silver? They placed it in a crucible and they subjected it to intense heat. And as the metals would melt, the impurity would rise to the top, and they would skim away the impurities, and they would refine gold and silver. And this passage is saying God is a refining fire. He's a launderer's soap, and I'm going to suggest to you that marriage is God's crucible. It's a place of transformation. It's a place where there's intense heat, intense conflict at times, intense stress at times. It's hard. It's not easy. Scripture says, perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. 2 Corinthians, let us purify ourselves from everything that contaminates body and spirit, perfecting what? Holiness out of reverence for God. And I like this quote. The state of marriage is one that requires more virtue and constancy than any other in spite of the bitter nature of its juice. you may be able to draw and make the honey of a holy life. If you're willing to be transformed, if you're willing to change, you may be able to draw and make the honey of a holy life together in your marriage. In conclusion, could I say it this way? Marriage is God's crucible. If you are selfish, God will use marriage to teach you to be unselfish and to be benevolent. If you're controlling, God will use marriage to teach you to be submissive. If you are irresponsible, God will use marriage to teach you to be accountable and trustworthy. If you're uncaring, God will use marriage to teach you to be compassionate and to be kind. If you're disagreeable, God will use marriage to teach you to be agreeable. If you're prideful, He'll teach you to be humble. If you're stubborn, He'll teach you to be yielding and reasonable. If you're impatient, He'll teach you to be accommodating, long-suffering. If you're unfair, He'll teach you to be partial. Are you with me? If you're willing to what? Be transformed. If you're willing to change. And then perhaps you can say, as this author, God worked in my life to change attitudes of bitterness, embarrassment, and resentment into attitudes of grace and love and hope. These new attitudes developed out of pain, self-sacrifice, and a little creativity. God accomplished this by walking with me through the hard times I longed to control, but could not. Oh, marriage is God's crucible. We soon encounter the flaw factor. It's not easy. But if we will allow it, if we're willing to allow God to mold us and shape us and change us, He'll transform us, watch this, into a holy and righteous people. Hey, today perhaps someone wants to say, hey, I'd like to make a commitment to a holy life together. I'd like to make a commitment to being transformed. We would give you that opportunity and encourage you to do so. If the church here can pray for you, would you please come while we stand and sing? Restore my spirit, Lord.